What made the most feared landowner in Montana ride 6 armed men across the territory to bring back one woman? Dust burst beneath the horse's hooves as the riders stopped outside the ranch gate. A chain rattled. Somewhere behind the barn, a horse let out a sharp, nervous snort. The woman stood perfectly still, one hand resting on the fence rail, while the man leading the riders pointed straight at her. Then Garrett heard the words that made the entire yard go silent. "Hand her over." Nobody moved. And the woman everyone thought had come looking for a husband finally stepped forward. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and join us for more unforgettable frontier stories. By the summer of 1886, most folks in Cedar Bluff had stopped trying to understand Garrett Hayes. Some said he worked too much. Others said a man could not lose the woman he planned to marry and ever be quite the same afterward. The truth sat somewhere between those things. Every morning before sunrise, Garrett crossed the yard of Red Canyon Ranch with a tin cup of black coffee in one hand. He checked fences, counted cattle, repaired whatever needed repairing. Then he did it all again the next day. The ranch survived, but it never felt alive. 3 years earlier, a flash flood in the mountains had taken the woman he intended to marry. Since then, Garrett had built walls faster than he built barns. Then came the pressure. Neighboring ranchers talked. The banker talked. Even the feed supplier talked. A man alone could only hold a ranch together for so long. So Garrett did something nobody expected. He placed a notice, not in Helena, not in Billings, just in the surrounding territories. The notice was short. Wife wanted. Must know how to ride. The entire town laughed. At Miller's General Store, old men repeated it over coffee. At the barber shop, somebody claimed Garrett was looking for a cowboy, not a wife. 3 weeks passed. Nothing happened. Then one hot afternoon, a trail of dust appeared beyond the southern road. A ranch hand spotted it first. "Rider coming?" Hammers stopped. Heads turned. Even the horses near the corral lifted their ears. Garrett rested both arms on the top rail and looked toward the road. The rider came fast, not reckless, certain. The horse beneath her was old but steady, carrying itself with the confidence of an animal that had crossed a great deal of country. Then she emerged from the dust. A black woman, travel-worn, no fancy dress, no trunks, no escort, only a weathered saddlebag and eyes that missed very little. She stopped at the gate. The yard went quiet. "You Garrett Hayes?" she asked. "I am." She nodded once. "I saw your notice." Several ranch hands exchanged looks. Garrett studied her. Most people arrived nervous. This woman looked like she had already survived worse things than Red Canyon Ranch. "What is your name?" "Delilah Monroe." The silence lingered. Then a crash echoed from the far side of the pasture. A young horse burst through a damaged section of fence and charged across the field. One ranch hand cursed. Another took off running. Garrett never took his eyes off Delilah. "You know how to ride?" Delilah glanced toward the runaway horse. Only one way to find out. Within moments they were mounted. Dust exploded beneath pounding hooves. The young horse cut across open ground, wild with panic. 2 cowboys had already failed to catch it that morning. Delilah rode after it without wasting movement. No shouting, no showing off. Just skill. She angled her horse wide, anticipating where the animal would turn rather than chasing where it had been. Garrett noticed. So did everyone else. Minutes later, the runaway slowed. Delilah eased alongside it. A hand moved. A rein caught. And somehow the fight left the horse almost as quickly as it had begun. When she rode back through the gate, leading the animal behind her, nobody laughed anymore. Walter Briggs removed his hat and scratched his gray head. "Well," he muttered, "I'll be damned." Garrett climbed down from his saddle. "You can stay." Delilah nodded. No smile, no celebration. Just relief hidden somewhere deep beneath her calm expression. That night, The ranch settled into darkness. Lanterns glowed softly. Crickets sang beyond the fences. Garrett crossed near the barn after checking the stock. Inside, Delilah was removing her saddle. Something slipped from her coat pocket. A folded document. Old. Official. A legal seal flashed briefly in the lantern light. Her reaction was immediate. She grabbed it before it fully hit the ground. For a second, she looked toward the doorway. Toward him. Then she tucked it away. Neither said a word. Hours later, unable to sleep, Garrett passed the main room and noticed a faint glow from the fireplace. Delilah knelt beside the hearth. A piece of paper curled black in the flames. Not the whole document, just part of it. She watched it burn until every word disappeared. Garrett stood unseen in the hallway. A woman who came looking for a husband should not have needed to destroy evidence in the middle of the night. Yet that was exactly what she had done. And for the first time since Delilah Monroe rode out of the dust, Garrett wondered what had truly brought her to Red Canyon Ranch. The next morning arrived clear and dry. Sunlight spilled across the Red Canyon walls and settled over the ranch yard in long golden bands. Garrett was already awake before dawn. He stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee and found Delilah in the corral. She was repairing a bridle. Not replacing it. Repairing it. Her fingers moved carefully through worn leather straps while a toolbox sat open beside her. Walter Briggs stood nearby watching. "You learned that somewhere special?" he asked. Delilah kept working. "No, sir." Walter chuckled. "That's usually where people learn the useful things." By breakfast, word had spread that she had repaired 3 pieces of tack that had been waiting weeks for attention. No one said much, but people noticed. Over the next several days, the ranch settled into a strange rhythm. Delilah never tried to fit in. She simply worked. One afternoon, she pointed out fresh hoof prints near the north pasture. The tracks didn't belong to Red Canyon cattle. Garrett followed them and discovered 2 missing steers hidden in a shallow draw beyond the ridge. The ranch hands spent the rest of the day bringing them home. Another morning, she noticed a weakness in a gate hinge before it failed. A day later, she spotted a sick calf before anyone else realized something was wrong. Little things. The sort of things that kept a ranch alive. The sort of things experienced people noticed. Walter Briggs noticed. More importantly, Garrett noticed. He found himself watching her when she wasn't looking. Not because she demanded attention, quite the opposite. She seemed determined not to draw any. That alone made her stand apart. Most evenings after supper, the ranch hands gathered outside the bunkhouse. Stories, coffee, cards, laughter. Delilah never joined them. She usually sat near the barn with a lantern and a book, or some piece of leatherwork in her hands. Alone, but not lonely. There was a difference. One afternoon, trouble came fast. A delivery wagon from town had arrived with supplies. One of the team horses spooked when a crate fell from the wagon. The animal jerked sideways. A young boy helping unload feed lost his footing directly in its path. Before anyone could react, Delilah moved. She grabbed the lead rope, spoke low, "Steady." The frightened horse settled almost immediately. The boy stood frozen, his face pale. Delilah dusted off his shoulder. "You all right?" The boy nodded. She returned to work. No speech, no drama. The entire thing lasted less than a minute. Garrett watched from the loading platform. Something about the way she handled danger bothered him. Not because she was reckless. Because she looked practiced. As if she'd spent years solving problems before other people realized there was one. Summer storms arrived suddenly in Montana. One evening, dark clouds rolled across the western sky while Garrett and Delilah were checking fence lines near the grazing flats. Rain hit before they could make it back. Within minutes, thunder echoed through the canyon. They found shelter beneath a rocky overhang overlooking the valley. The storm poured down in silver sheets. Neither spoke for several minutes. The sound of rain filled the silence. Garrett pulled off his hat and wiped water from the brim. "You always travel alone?" Delilah watched the storm. "Most of the time." "That's not easy." "No." The answer ended there. A flash of lightning illuminated the canyon. For a moment, her face looked older than it usually did. Not older in years, older in experience. Garrett stared out at the rain. "You mentioned Wyoming." Delilah nodded. "I worked for a land office outside Cheyenne." That surprised him. "As a clerk?" "Something like that." "What happened?" For the first time since she'd arrived, Delilah hesitated. The pause lasted only a second, but Garrett saw it. Then she looked back toward the storm. Life happened. Nothing more. The conversation ended there. The rain eventually passed. They rode home beneath a sky streaked with orange and purple. Neither spoke much during the ride. But something had shifted. The distance between them felt smaller than it had that morning. The following day, Garrett rode into Cedar Bluff for supplies. The town looked the same as always. Dusty streets, a wagon outside the mercantile, the smell of fresh bread drifting from the bakery. Then he noticed a stranger. The man stood near the saloon talking quietly with the owner. He wore a dark coat despite the heat. When Garrett entered the general store, Walter's nephew caught his arm. "You hear about the fellow asking questions?" Garrett frowned. "What fellow?" The young man lowered his voice. "Someone looking for a woman." Garrett felt something tighten. The stranger unfolded a paper. Several people leaned closer. On the page was a rough sketch. Not perfect, but close enough. A woman, dark braid, sharp eyes. Delilah. The stranger laid a few coins on the counter. "Reward for information." The room grew noticeably quieter. Garrett stared across the street through the store window. The stranger folded the paper and moved on to the next business. Asking, watching, waiting. And for the first time since Delilah arrived at Red Canyon Ranch, Garrett realized she wasn't simply carrying secrets. Someone was actively searching for her. The question was no longer whether trouble existed. The question was how far behind it truly was. Garrett found out sooner than he wanted. News traveled quickly in Cedar Bluff. A stranger asking questions was one thing. A reward notice was another. Within 2 days, people who had nodded politely to Delilah on the boardwalk began watching her differently. Not openly, not cruelly, just cautiously. The way people looked at a storm cloud gathering beyond the mountains. Delilah noticed. She noticed everything. One afternoon, she stopped at the mercantile to buy thread and lamp oil. Conversation faded when she walked through the door. The silence lasted only a moment, but it lasted long enough. On the ride back to Red Canyon Ranch, she said nothing. Garrett rode beside her. The canyon walls glowed red beneath the lowering sun. Finally, he spoke. "You don't owe anybody explanations." Delilah kept her eyes on the trail. "That's not usually how towns work." "No." A small smile touched the corner of his mouth. "It isn't." For the first time since she'd arrived, she looked at him for longer than a few seconds. There was gratitude there. Quiet and careful. The kind that didn't ask for anything. As July drifted toward August, the ranch continued moving forward. Cattle needed water. Fences needed repair. Hay needed cutting. Life rarely stopped long enough for secrets, yet Garrett found himself paying more attention. Not because he distrusted Delilah, because he worried. One evening, while delivering invoices and supply receipts into town, he noticed something unusual. Delilah standing outside the post office. She wasn't mailing a letter. She was handing one to an older stagecoach driver heading east. The exchange lasted only a moment. The envelope disappeared into the man's coat pocket. When she turned and saw Garrett across the street, neither mentioned it. But Garrett remembered. 3 days later, trouble arrived, just after sunrise. Walter Briggs was repairing a wagon wheel when he spotted riders approaching from the southern road. 6 of them, traveling together, purposefully. The atmosphere around the ranch changed instantly. Work slowed, heads lifted. Garrett stepped out from the barn and narrowed his eyes. The riders crossed the final stretch of road and stopped at the front gate. The man at their center sat a chestnut horse, expensive boots, clean coat, cold eyes, a man used to getting his way. "Morning," he called. Garrett remained where he was. "Depends." A faint smile crossed the stranger's face. "Clay Mercer." The name meant something. Several ranch hands exchanged glances. Clay Mercer owned land south of the territory line and had a reputation for winning disputes nobody else seemed able to win. "What brings you here?" Garrett asked. Clay's gaze drifted across the ranch, then settled on Delilah. She had emerged from the stable carrying a feed bucket. For the first time since arriving, Garrett saw her completely freeze. Only for a second. But it happened. Clay noticed too. "There she is." Silence spread across the yard. Walter stopped hammering. A horse shifted inside the corral. Clay rested both hands on his saddle horn. "I'm here for her." Nobody spoke. Delilah slowly set down the bucket. Garrett stepped forward. "For what reason?" Clay's answer came easily. "She's a thief." The word landed hard. Several ranch hands looked toward Delilah. Garrett did too. Not because he believed it. Because he needed to hear her answer. Delilah met Clay's eyes, then Garrett's, and said nothing. The silence hurt more than a denial would have. Clay continued. "She stole property belonging to me." Still nothing. Garrett felt doubt creep into places where trust had begun to settle. Not certainty, just doubt. Eventually, Clay adjusted his reins. "I'll be back." Then the riders turned and left. The dust from their horses lingered long after they disappeared. That night, sleep refused to come. Near midnight, Garrett noticed a faint light beneath Delilah's door. He hesitated, then knocked. No answer. The door wasn't fully closed. Inside sat a leather satchel on the small table, partially open. Garrett shouldn't have looked. He knew that. But the sight stopped him cold. Documents. Dozens of them. Land records. Property transfers. Official seals. Names. Dates. Signatures. One name appeared repeatedly. Clay Mercer. Footsteps sounded outside. Garrett stepped away just before Delilah entered. Neither spoke immediately. The room felt smaller. The lantern between them flickered softly. Finally, Garrett looked at her. "What are those papers?" Delilah's expression tightened. For a long moment she seemed to weigh something. Then she answered, "I took them." The admission hung in the air. No explanation. No defense, just the truth. Garrett stared at her. "You took them?" "Yes." His jaw tightened. The woman who had earned respect across the ranch. The woman he had started trusting. The woman he found himself watching when she wasn't looking, now stood before him, admitting she had stolen something from one of the most powerful landowners in the territory. Yet something still didn't fit. Because guilty people usually hid behind excuses. Delilah wasn't hiding. She simply looked tired, as though carrying something far heavier than those papers. Garrett glanced toward the satchel again, then back at her. The questions kept multiplying, and for the first time since she rode out of the dust, he no longer knew whether he was protecting Delilah from danger or protecting his ranch from her. Garrett barely slept that night. The lantern in his room burned low while the wind moved softly against the cabin walls. Across the yard, Delilah's light remained visible for hours. Neither of them came looking for the other. Neither knew what to say. The next morning arrived gray and heavy. Clouds hung over Red Canyon, like a blanket pulled too tight. Work continued, but the easy rhythm that had settled over the ranch was gone. The men felt it. Walter Briggs felt it. Even the horses seemed restless. Delilah worked as she always had. She mended a fence line near the eastern pasture, checked water troughs, helped load feed sacks. Yet a distance had appeared, not just between her and the ranch, between her and Garrett. Several times he started toward her. Several times he stopped. Every conversation felt unfinished before it began. 3 days later, the sound of riders returned. This time everyone heard them. A dozen people stepped onto porches and boardwalks as the group entered Cedar Bluff. Clay Mercer had come back. And he had not come alone. Beside him rode Deputy Frank Harlow from the county office. The sight sent whispers through town. Official authority changed everything. By noon, nearly half the town had gathered near the courthouse square. Garrett arrived on horseback. Walter came with him. Delilah rode behind them. Her face gave away nothing. Clay sat comfortably beneath the awning of the mercantile, as though he already knew how the day would end. When he saw Delilah, he smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a man who believed time was finally on his side. Deputy Harlow unfolded several papers. The woman known as Delilah Monroe is accused of theft of legal property documents. The words rolled through the crowd. Someone shifted nervously. Someone else looked away. Garrett remained still. Clay rose slowly. Tell them what you stole. Delilah looked around the square. At the townspeople. At Walter. At Garrett. At the mountains rising beyond Cedar Bluff. Then she took a breath, and finally spoke. Years earlier she had worked in a land office in Wyoming. Not simply filing paperwork, reviewing property transfers, recording ownership claims. One winter she discovered something strange. Entire parcels of land changing hands through documents that should never have been approved. Widows losing property. Former soldiers losing grazing rights. Families receiving eviction notices for land they legally owned. At first she thought it was a mistake. Then she found more and more. Eventually she brought her concerns to an attorney investigating fraudulent claims. The attorney began collecting evidence. Names, signatures, transfers, forged records. One name appeared repeatedly. Clay Mercer. The crowd grew silent. No one interrupted. The only sound came from a loose sign creaking in the afternoon wind. The attorney intended to take everything before a federal review board, Delilah said. But he never got the chance. She paused. Her eyes dropped briefly toward the dusty street. He died before the hearing. No dramatic details, no accusations, just a fact. The kind people understood without explanation. Before his death, he had entrusted the documents to her, the originals, the evidence, everything. From that day forward, she became the easiest person to blame, the easiest person to chase, the easiest person to silence. A murmur spread through the crowd. Garrett felt something twist inside his chest. Every piece suddenly fit. The burned letter, the legal seal, the fear she never admitted, the constant watching. She had never been protecting herself. She had been protecting proof. Walter removed his hat. Several others followed. Clay's expression darkened. Then suddenly he laughed, loud enough for everyone to hear. The sound echoed across the square. Wonderful story. The laughter faded. Clay looked directly at Delilah, then at the crowd. You forgot one thing. His voice sharpened. The local judge already reviewed these claims. The crowd stirred. Clay continued. And he found nothing wrong. Deputy Harlow nodded reluctantly. It was true. The local judge had dismissed every complaint months earlier. A cold feeling settled over the square. Delilah's shoulders stiffened. For the first time, uncertainty appeared in her eyes. Clay saw it and pressed harder. Those papers won't save anyone. The confidence returned to his face. Because nobody important believes them. Garrett watched hope drain from several faces around him, the townspeople who had begun believing her. Walter. Even Delilah. Clay stepped forward. The hearing is over. Deputy Harlow looked uncomfortable, but duty remained duty. Slowly he reached for the papers authorizing Delilah's detention. The crowd fell silent. Garrett felt anger rise inside him, not because Delilah had lied, because she hadn't. Every difficult thing suddenly made sense. Every mile she'd traveled, every secret she'd carried, every cautious glance over her shoulder. She had been telling the truth all along. Yet the truth wasn't winning. And as Deputy Harlow approached, it became painfully clear that Clay Mercer was closer to victory than ever before. Delilah stood alone in the center of the square, the evidence in her possession, the people she had tried to protect, the years she had spent running. All of it seemed ready to collapse beneath the weight of one man's influence. And for the first time since she arrived at Red Canyon Ranch, Garrett saw something he had never seen in her before. Not fear, not surrender, but exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who had carried a burden for too long and was running out of places left to stand. Garrett saw it in her eyes as the crowd slowly dispersed from the square. Clay Mercer rode away satisfied. Deputy Harlow remained behind to complete paperwork that nobody seemed eager to discuss. Walter Briggs stood near the hitching rail with his hat in his hands. No one knew what to say. By sunset, Red Canyon Ranch felt quieter than it had in years. The wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek. A screen door creaked somewhere near the bunkhouse. The cattle settled for the night, and Delilah sat alone beside the corral. Garrett found her there after dark. She was watching midnight graze beneath the moonlight. For several moments neither spoke. Then Garrett rested his arms on the fence. "When are they coming for you?" "Tomorrow morning." His jaw tightened. Delilah nodded toward the horse. "He likes this place." "So do I." That finally drew a small smile from her. A tired one, but real. The silence returned. Not uncomfortable, just honest. After a while, Garrett spoke again. "You know why I put that notice out?" Delilah looked at him. "I figured because people wouldn't leave you alone." A soft laugh escaped him. That was part of it. The moonlight caught the lines around his eyes, lines carved there by weather, loss, and years of carrying responsibility. "My fiancé could ride better than most men I knew." Delilah listened quietly. 3 years ago, we were moving cattle through a mountain pass after heavy rain. His gaze drifted toward the darkness beyond the pasture. "We never saw the water coming." The words came slowly, not because he wanted sympathy, because some memories still weighed the same no matter how much time passed. "I spent a long time thinking if I'd been stronger, faster, smarter." He shook his head. Didn't matter. She was gone. The night grew still. Somewhere beyond the canyon, an owl called once, then silence. Garrett looked at Delilah. "When I wrote that notice, I told myself I wanted a wife who could ride." His voice softened. "Truth is, I wanted someone strong enough to share a hard life." Delilah lowered her eyes. For the first time since arriving at Red Canyon Ranch, she looked uncertain, not afraid, just careful. Garrett continued, "And you're the first person who's made me believe that life might be worth sharing again." Neither moved. Neither rushed the moment. The words settled between them like something fragile, something neither wanted to break. Early the next morning, a wagon waited outside the county office. Deputy Harlow stood nearby. The town gathered again, not out of curiosity this time, out of concern. Walter arrived before sunrise. Several ranch hands came as well. Garrett never left Delilah's side. Clay Mercer appeared shortly before the hearing. His confidence had returned. He greeted people as though the outcome had already been decided. Then, just before proceedings began, another wagon rolled into Cedar Bluff. Dust covered its wheels. Federal markings decorated the side panel. The square fell silent. A tall man stepped down carrying a leather case. Another followed. Then a third. One introduced himself as a federal land inspector from Helena. The second carried official correspondence. The third held a sealed packet of records. Clay's smile disappeared. Slowly. Completely. The inspector unfolded a document. A letter was received several weeks ago requesting review of disputed land transfers. His eyes moved across the square, then settled on Delilah. The request included copies of supporting evidence. A murmur spread through the crowd. Garrett suddenly remembered the stagecoach driver. The letter. The secret delivery. Delilah had never stopped fighting, even when nobody knew it, even when nobody believed her. The hearing changed direction almost immediately. Original records were produced. Signatures were verified. Transfers were examined. One by one, the pieces fell into place. The truth had arrived before Clay could bury it. By noon, the findings were clear. Several property claims had indeed been falsified. Multiple families had been affected. The evidence Delilah protected was legitimate. Clay Mercer sat silent. For the first time since Garrett met him, the man had nothing left to say. When officials escorted him away, the square remained quiet. Not because people were shocked, because they were relieved. The weight hanging over the town finally lifted. Later that afternoon, Garrett and Delilah sat on the courthouse steps while the crowd slowly disappeared. Neither spoke for a while. Then an elderly rancher approached. His hands trembled slightly with age. I knew one of the families on those records. He removed his hat. They saved a traveler during the winter of '69. Garrett frowned. The old man nodded. A man named Samuel Hayes. Garrett froze. His father. The old rancher smiled faintly. Without them, your father never would have made it home. The realization struck slowly. Then all at once. One of the families Delilah had spent years protecting had once saved his own family. A debt of gratitude stretching back nearly 2 decades. A connection neither of them could have known. Yet somehow it brought everything together. Weeks later, autumn arrived. The first cool mornings touched the canyon. Cottonwood leaves turned gold along the creek. The sky stretched bright and endless above Montana. Garrett saddled 2 horses before sunrise. Delilah met him outside the barn. No questions, just trust. They rode toward the western pasture where she had first proven herself months earlier. The same stretch of land, the same open sky, the same red cliffs glowing beneath morning light. They stopped near the place where she had first ridden the wild horse. Wind moved softly through the grass. Garrett looked at her. I thought I was looking for a wife who could ride. Delilah smiled. He continued. Turns out I was waiting for the woman brave enough to stay. For a moment, she simply looked at him. Then her eyes drifted toward the dusty road leading away from Red Canyon Ranch. The road she had arrived on. The road she had spent years traveling, running, surviving, searching. When she looked back at Garrett, the answer was already there. She nudged her horse closer. Not dramatically, not for anyone else's benefit. Just enough. The way people do when they finally know where they belong. Together they turned their horses toward home. The canyon opened before them, wide, quiet, endless. No one was chasing Delilah anymore. No secrets remained between them. Only the land, the ranch, and the life waiting ahead. Side by side, they rode through the autumn sunlight toward Red Canyon Ranch and whatever future they would build together. Maybe that's why this story stays with us long after the dust settles. Not because Delilah uncovered the truth. Not because Clay Mercer was finally brought to justice. And not even because Garrett found the courage to love again. It stays with us because at some point in life, most of us have been one of them. Maybe you've been the person carrying a burden nobody else could see. Maybe you've spent years looking over your shoulder, wondering if you'll ever find a place where you can finally rest. Or maybe you've been like Garrett, holding on to an old loss so tightly that you stopped believing there was room in your heart for anything new. What makes this story special is that neither of them was rescued by a miracle. They were changed by trust, by small acts of kindness, by choosing to stand beside someone when it would have been easier to walk away. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive all at once. Sometimes it rides in quietly, covered in dust, asking for nothing more than a chance to stay. And sometimes love begins the moment two people stop running from the past and start facing the future together. I'd love to know what part of this story stayed with you the most. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if stories like this remind you of the strength, hope, and connection that can still be found in the world, I hope you'll join us again. There are many more heartfelt journeys, forgotten secrets, and unforgettable people waiting just down the trail in the next story.